The Orchard Keeper by Cormac McCarthy. This book is the first book published by American poet, playwright, screenwriter, author, jack of all trades, one of the greatest living writers currently, Mr. Cormac McCarthy. This is not the first Cormac book that I've read. The first one that I actually read was, the magnum opus, Blood Meridian, which most people say, don't start with Blood Meridian. But, I mean, come on. You see the synopsis, you hear about the character, the judge, and you think, you got to read that. So I did, fell in love with it, and I thought, I've got to read the rest of Cormac McCarthy's works. And diving back to his first one, we have The Orchard Keeper. Now, The Orchard Keeper, as far as basic plot goes, revolves around three major characters. You have John Wesley Ratner, Marion Silder, and Arthur Ownby. Let's begin with John Wesley Ratner. John Wesley Ratner is the primary protagonist of the story. He's a young teenage boy, I want to say 14 or 15 or something like that. And all these characters live in a small East Tennessee community called Red Branch, which is near Knoxville in the East Tennessee mountains. And so the whole story is you have John Wesley Ratner, who's this young teenage boy. His father is murdered early on in the novel by another major character, Marion Silder, who's a bootlegger, outlaw, moonshiner, because this is during the 1930s, so I believe it's Prohibition era. And the orchard keeper is Arthur Ownby, who is an old man, and he guards a rotting apple orchard, and he is the one who ends up guarding John Wesley Ratner's dad's body throughout the novel. And that's the main plot of The Orchard Keeper. But to get into further details, first I'll describe sort of the different character traits of these three guys. So my favorite character of the novel is Marion Silder. Marion Silder, which, by the way, side note, I imagine, if there was a live-action version of this book, I feel like Shia LaBeouf would play Marion Silder, but that's just me. Marion Silder is the bootlegger outlaw who is running whiskey and running moonshine and is sort of an outcast of the society, but he drives a cool car, he drives people around, seems like a fun guy to be with, he's always looking for adventure. And unfortunately, this ends up bringing him to cross paths with a man named Kenneth Ratner early on in the novel. And Kenneth Ratner tries to rob Silder and tries to whack him with a tire iron. And so Silder ends up getting in a confrontation with him and murdering Kenneth Ratner, who happens to be the boy's father in the novel. Now, that is the main inciting, thing that happens that causes the plot, that propels the plot forward and makes things happen. And you'd think that, this would be a major plot point and that Silder would be the antagonist of the story and John Wesley Ratner would go avenge his father and all this stuff. But none of that happens. The complete opposite happens. In fact, not only does John Wesley Ratner not avenge his father by going after Silder, he and Silder actually become best friends. Plot twist. Thank you, Cormac, for your awesome plot twists. However, neither one of the two characters know that Kenneth Ratner, Silder doesn't know that he killed the boy's dad. The boy doesn't know that Silder is the guy that killed his dad, vice versa. You get the point. Neither one of them know how they're connected in this incident. And Arthur Ownby, the old man who watches the apple orchard, he ends up finding the body just kind of tossed aside by Silder on his property one day, and he ends up, instead of alerting authorities, he ends up just guarding the body, watching over it. And that is sort of the main plot, that's what happens in The Orchard Keeper. There's a lot of various scenes interconnected. I've heard people say that Cormac's writing style in this novel is very Faulknerian, and it's, the way that he writes. I haven't read any Faulkner yet, so I can't speak on that, but I plan on it. But Arthur Ownby, the old man, I feel like he represents the major theme of the novel, which is man's impending disturbance of nature and how, society and change and, in with the old, out with the new is constantly coming for us. I'm sorry. In with the new, out with the old. And Arthur Ownby is a perfect, representation of this. He's set in his ways. He's this old guy. He sits on the porch. He drinks his whiskey. He pets his dog. He tells stories about the old days. And he has no interest in you know, anything to do with any sort of new technological or civilization developments going on in this East Tennessee community, which, spoiler alert, they end up happening anyway. And by the end of the novel, you have Arthur Ownby resisting the change and resisting the government of the time by shooting up a government tank, a government installation tank. And this is sort of a symbol of him just retaliating, using his will to fight against this government. And this is a theme that will occur later on in Cormac's works, but this is a very the subtle beginnings of that. And while this is happening, Sildur is running moonshine, and he ends up getting in a car accident. And John Wesley is happened to check his traps, and he finds Sildur, and the two help each other out. And from that point on to the end of the novel, Sildur and the boy sort of become like a father and son. And Sildur becomes a surrogate father to John Wesley, which, Cormac never really talks about or describes John Wesley's relationship with his actual father, Kenneth, in the novel. So I think it's meant to be implied that Kenneth maybe wasn't that great of a father to John Wesley, hence why he's doesn't seem very bothered by his dad being gone. He actually seems maybe a little bit relieved, like he doesn't want to live in his dad's shadow. And he and Sildur just, hit it off, and they become really good friends, have a really solid relationship. And I think John Wesley really learns a lot from Sildur and Arthur in this book. He learns about the dangers of letting go of the past, the dangers of sort of going blindly into the future without holding on to something important and learning from the past. And this is the most evident in a plot point where John Wesley, at the beginning of the book, kills a hawk. Or I can't remember if he kills the hawk or if he finds it, but he finds a hawk, a dead hawk. And he takes it into Knoxville and turns it in for a bounty, and he gets the money for it. By the end of the novel, after all the events have taken place, which, spoiler alert, Marion Sildur ends up getting thrown in prison, and Arthur Ownby ends up getting basically thrown into a loony bin and displaced. And John Wesley sees the effect he sees the change of this Tennessee community that he's from, and he feels as though he may be responsible or that he has some sort of accountability. And he ends up, by the end of the novel, going back and trying to buy the hawk back from the pawn shop. And I feel like which symbolizes him wanting to give back to nature. He's seen so many people take things away from nature, take things away from where they seem to belong, and he had a hand in that by taking the hawk away from nature, and he wants to give it back. He saw Arthur taken from his home. He saw Sildur taken from his home. And John Wesley maybe wants to fight that, like Arthur fought the government tank. So at the end of the novel, John Wesley's walking around Red Branch, and there's really no sign of the community that once was there when he was a boy. And the final line of the novel is myth, legend, dust. That's all it's described as. And that's the plot, the basic plot synopsis of the story. To get into, I guess, pros and cons. First of all, pros. That's funny. No pun intended. The prose is really good in this novel. It is the early beginnings of the way Cormac McCarthy writes, which he'll go on later to obviously perfect in amazing books later on that I can't wait to talk about. But it's a little bit more subtle in this book. It's harder to pick up on. I feel like, strangely enough, this felt tougher to read than even Blood Meridian to me, because there's a lot of jumping around and perspective shifts, and I think that may be where the Faulknerian kind of, comparison comes from. But for a lot of the novel, you're kind of figuring out who even is this character that we're talking about here, and like what's going on here, who's killing who. There's one whole chapter that's fully in the perspective of a panther, and you don't really know it until like later on. You're kind of like, oh, that chapter was, that was a panther that was walking around for 5 pages. So there's things like that it's a little bit challenging. It's a little bit kind of hard to crack into. But the descriptions in here are beautiful. I just want to read one passage in here that It's really early on. Talking about the people of Red Branch and, well, the houses of Red Branch. They were rented to families of gaunt, hollow-eyed, and dark-skinned people, not Melungeons and not exactly anything else, who reproduced with such frightening prolificness that their entire lives appear devoted to the production of the ragged line of scions, which shoeless and tattered sat for hours at a time on the porch edges, themselves not unlike the victims of some terrible disaster, and stared out across the blighted land with expressions of neither hope nor wonder nor despair. And that's just 12 pages in. So as you can see, there's a lot of those really dense sentences and really, words that you might have to look up, and you might have to catch your breath when you're reading some of these sentences. But it's just beautiful. There's a lot of beautiful writing in here. He cultivates an atmosphere in this book that feels very authentic. You can feel the coldness of the East Tennessee winter. You can imagine the snow, and then like the leaves of the fall underneath, like crunching underneath, and then it's just very atmospheric and very woodsy, and it's sort of a warm book in a way. It's probably, I've read most of his works up until The Road at this point, and this has been, I haven't read Suttree yet, but this has been probably his warmest book, if that makes any sense. So yeah, and another pro, Marion Silder, is a really cool character. I'd put him up there as one of my favorite McCarthy characters. He's just really likable, cool, seems like a fun dude to hang out with and go, moonshine bootlegging with at some point. But yeah, as far as the cons, I think I sort of touched on it earlier. I think the main detractor from the book is that he makes you work really hard to understand what's going on, and then once you understand what is going on, it feels sort of anticlimactic is the best way I can put it. It feels a little bit inconsequential. And what I mean by that is you're sort of expecting I think you're sort of, with the intensity of the language here and the murder, especially early on in the novel, you're expecting something to happen. Things feel like they're building up to something, and all that happens is Arthur gets thrown in a loony bin, Silder gets arrested, and John Wesley tries to buy a hawkback, and that's the main, Act 3 set piece of the book. And maybe it's meant to be that way. Cormac is always, subverting expectations and doing different things. But it left me wanting a little bit more, which thankfully the next book that I'll talk about really helped that and actually exceeded my expectations, but that'll be in a later video. But nevertheless, The Orchard Keeper by Cormac McCarthy is a really good read. It's definitely not Cormac's best writing. I would not start with this at all. This is not me hounding the book or putting it down, but this is my least favorite Cormac McCarthy work. But it's great if you want to read all of his books and see where he started. And yeah, if you're a Cormac McCarthy fan, or you're just picking up his books and you want to read everything, pick up The Orchard Keeper. I'd recommend it. It's solid writing, cool characters. The ending and story leaves a little bit to be desired, but hey, he really pays off on later books. I would give The Orchard Keeper a 5 out of 10. Thank you guys so much for listening to this book review of The Orchard Keeper by Cormac McCarthy, and I will see you guys on the next book review. Thank you.